Alrighty, and we're on. I'm here with an old training partner and friend, Alex Goik. Say hello. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, Alex Goik. Actually, that's only half of my last name. The first part is Trout, pronounced like the fish, Trout.
Trout, yeah.
And that's like from my mum's side, and she's German.
Yep.
And then Goik is originally Ukrainian, so my parents decided to make life a little difficult for me and put them together as my last name. So I shorten it to Goik on some like Instagram and things.
So otherwise it's meant to be Trout Goik.
Trout Goik, yeah, it is.
Okay, so Alex and I, we used to train together down at Full Circle MMA in Wollongong. I guess we're part of the morning crew as well because Alex used to come in the mornings. I was always there in the mornings, and we trained together. And I feel like it's one of those things. Once you sort of punched each other enough. You sort of form a decent enough bond where it's like nothing you really can say to the other person is going to hurt more than the punches that you hit each other with.
That's exactly right. Although I do remember seeing a video of you, Johnny, hanging upside down, getting punched by Isaac, and there were no words of love exchanged during that phase of training.
Yep.
But yeah, man, that was for me, training at Full Circle was such a catalytic experience for me, both in terms of where I wanted to go with martial arts and what I wanted to do, but also after having the experience of training there and then preparing for my first cage fight and then doing the cage fight and winning that, and to go all through that and to perform at a level that I was happy with was very transformative in terms of my appreciation for what I was capable of. And for me, that's something that martial arts does so well to promote, and why I'm always going to be an avid fan and an avid practitioner is that it really, if you're in the right environment, it can push you past where you thought you were before, and a good gym will do that. But I also think, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about, whether that was attained at Full Circle or whether it wasn't, is that you need to walk, there's a fine balance between having an environment where you can push people past what they thought they were capable of and having an environment where people can feel safe enough to make mistakes, because that's also very important to developing your skills, developing your technique and becoming more confident, both on and off the mats. So now, having started coaching Jiu Jitsu myself a few years later, I'm really trying to navigate and walk that tightrope between being the coach that expects a lot from the students and will push them past what they thought they were capable of, and also building a environment that is a healthy environment that people want to come back to and that they can feel safe making mistakes and not getting penalized for it. And so, I mean, for yourself, you've now trained at a bunch of different gyms. So what was your experience of training at Full Circle like, and how would you characterize it?
So I find this it's a really interesting question, and I think about this a lot personally as well, because like martial arts has been such a massive part of my whole life, right? And I've been training since I started karate when I was 5, did karate all the way up until maybe 11 or 12, had a couple of years off, got into Kung Fu, did Kung Fu for 20 odd years of my life. You met me when I was down at Full Circle, so that would have been like 8 years ago now, and was there for 5 years while I was working down in Wollongong. In that time, I started training Jiu Jitsu at Integrated Combat Centre, and part of that was, originally, like, I was just rolling with the guys there, and Dave, as a coach there, he said to me, "Johnny, you're here every Sunday. You might as well just like sign up so that at least I can give you the rank to go along with it. Like, you've got the skills. It's not about this. Of course, there's still about, you got to respect the gi and all that sort of stuff and learn that aspect of it. But you're already here and you're training, and so you might as well just pursue it and get something to go with it." And at the same time, I train kickboxing at another gym here, JNS Muay Thai, and I've also been doing some rounds with Coach Renato with his team at MMA Family Fight Team. So I've experienced a lot of different places, and I think there's no one formula to get it right. Yeah, and I know, like, so from Russ's perspective, so Russ Thompson, he was the head coach down there. He was quite a strict coach, right? And I think, he was very demanding as a coach and wanted the best out of his people. And I think, there's many different mindsets. And I'll give you this example, right? So for me, like coming from to the traditional side of martial arts, you're always taught to be respectful, right? So you get taught to be respectful, and they sort of coach you to always, try and be respectful of your seniors and blah, 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 which is great. But then when it comes to then application and when you really need to test yourself, you know, so if you're preparing for comps and things like that, you need to dial up the pressure, right? And so if you're always respectful, it's very hard to dial up the pressure. And then if you factor in that, hey, now there might be a skill gap, right? So if I'm better than the other person and the other person's competing, and I decide that, hey, because I'm better than them, I'm going to take it a little bit easy on them, or I go a bit lax in terms of how I approach them, that's actually not in their benefit, is it?
Right.
Because now they're getting away with mistakes that they shouldn't be getting away with, right? Because me as a friend and a training partner, look, it's not such a big deal to me. But then if I operate like that with them, I'm giving them a false sense of security, so that when they're in that competitive environment, they're now facing somebody who will not allow them to make those mistakes and punish those mistakes. So then, you know, you start to think, okay, well, perhaps going light on my friend wasn't the right thing to do, right? And so one of the things that I've and this is the way I'll summarize it, right? So if we think about respect in martial arts, there's different perspectives on the word respect, right? So for me, the way I sort of look at it is that depending on who I'm training with, respect might be actually doing my best against you, right? If you're somebody that I respect in terms of your martial arts ability, well, I should come at you with my best. So then that way that's me showing respect to you, right? Versus, we'll just take it easy because you're my friend and blah, blah, blah. That's actually disrespectful because I'm not helping you to get better, right? And so I think that's the fine line of it, because there's a lot of places where, you know, if you operate with that mindset, it escalates very quickly and things get heated because people are thinking that you're a bully, right? Because you're bashing this other person because you might have a better skill, a higher level of skill. But that's not actually the aim. And that's where I'd say, you know, I think it's important that you obviously talk to your training partners as well, right? Because then they understand where you're coming from. There are some guys who, you know, when you go to the gym, they just want to throw down. And so if they want to throw down, it's actually disrespectful for you to cower away, right? It's the old, you got to face your fears, right? And then so I think it's a real balance. Whereas, you know, with a beginner, there's no point beating up on that beginner and having them cower up and then go, martial arts isn't for me. I'm not cut out for this, right? I think I saw somebody like one of the coach, like some coach online commenting about, you know, people talk about fighters' heart, right? And some people say, you know, you can't train heart. It's in there or not. But then on the flip side, if you've taken a beating that many times, how are you actually developing your heart? Because you don't know that you could actually just push it. That's just that little mark further. Because you've always been taken way past your limit, right? And I think, you know, I think your mindset and my mindset is quite similar in terms of the consistency of training. We always want to be able to train every day, right? So there's no point going and smashing ourselves and putting 120% into that session and then being put out for 2 weeks, right? We want to take us as close to 100% as possible, but then be able to come back the next day and do it again, right? And if that means that the next day, maybe I can only train up to 80% because I'm sore or whatever else, I'm better off at least doing that and still coming back the next day than being put so far out of my comfort zone that I can't walk or I can't do this, right? So I think that's the balancing act, right? And you know, I guess from your perspective, you know, you've trained in a couple of places, right? What has been the mindset of those different places from your perspective?
Yeah, look, they've all emphasized different things, and I definitely feel like a hallmark of a good coach is someone that is able to take all of those skills and lessons that they've gotten from a bunch of different places and integrate that into a new system or a system that they think will work best in the context that they're in. You know, I learned a lot from different places, man. When I was in China, I was training MMA in Shanghai for a brief period, and when I was over there, man, that was a very, very, very lonely experience because I was in China and I was just over there studying Chinese intensively, and MMA was really the thing, and martial arts was the thing that kept me afloat during those times because they were very lonely. Foreign country. I was the only person that spoke English as a first language in my class.
Yep.
And my Chinese at that time wasn't developed to the level where I could engage in a meaningful way with people to make friends.
Yep.
And so, you know, I would be catching this subway about an hour and a half across the city to the MMA gym that I was training at, and it was run by this guy called Ramsey Dewey, who's now actually pretty famous on YouTube. He's got like a bunch of different things up there. He kind of does a few videos debunking, you know, self-defense people that advocate like self-defense moves and things like that. He does a few videos like that, but he was a great coach, and one of the things that there were a few things he taught me, but one of them was the importance of moving your own body, like and what we would do at the start of those classes. We'd often get, being in Shanghai, like a very metropolitan city, a lot of different people coming through for a bunch of different reasons. So you would have like a core group of people, but then a lot of people that would come through for maybe only a month or 2 months or whatever. And he would get the whole class, irrespective of their skill level, to start. We would all be doing, the classic like forward rolls and things like that. But then we would do cartwheels, headstands, all these different movements moving around. And everyone, when they were first there on the first day, were saying, I can't do that, this is crazy, and things like that.
Yep.
If they stuck with it for a couple of weeks, they would be moving around the mats, moving really good, and you could see it translate into their confidence when it came to wrestling and when it came to jiu-jitsu in particular. There were also experiences there where, because in China at the time, it's probably similar now, but if you're a foreign fighter, you get paid a lot. So there were a lot of Russian guys, a lot of guys from Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, which have quite strong wrestling backgrounds that would come to China and just beat up everyone because they were really good, and then fly back over and kind of ping pong between their home country and China competing. And that was a great experience to fight some very grizzly guys from Russia and to spar with these guys and to see what it's like, because it's very important. I think you and I have talked about this before, and we definitely align in the fact where people do martial arts for different reasons, and people are serious about it for different reasons. And one of the reasons people do it, like in my context, one of the reasons I started was because of the bullying that I received, but I was never a very aggressive person. But the other attractive person that is attracted to martial arts is the aggressive person that will use those skills and then go and try and test it out on the street, and they're using it to hurt people, which I'm, against. But it's interesting because like over the years of training martial arts, you encounter both types of people, and then you encounter maybe like the hobbyists who aren't as serious, but you encounter guys that you're training with that when you hit them, you see like a bit of the demon flare up in their eyes, right? You can see that they have a proclivity for violence, like a natural proclivity.
It wakes them up.
It does, man. It does. And, as someone that doesn't have that aggression, or at least is a bit fearful, I feel like as men and as human beings, we have a natural, hunter side of our psyche, a kind of our psyche that's often repressed given the contemporary constraints of society that we live in, the laws we abide by, the social norms that we have to follow. But there is this underlying propensity for violence, particularly in the male psyche, that if it's not expressed in a healthy way can lead to some very negative outcomes. And for me, martial arts has been a way to recognize that is in me as well. Granted, not to the same kind of extent as some of these people that I'm describing, but that's in me as well. And martial arts is the path to integrating that kind of energy, if you would use like an archetype type metaphor and describe that as like a kind of barbarian mentality, how you can understand that and start to wield that as the typical kind of samurai type character,
comes strength.
Exactly. And then there's this age-old saying that it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener during the war, and that's the mentality that I have. It's very much aligned with Georges St. Pierre in that regard, because one of the things that he says is that whenever he went into the cage, he was petrified. Right. And this is something that Mike Tyson's trainer talks about as well. Saying that, courage is not feeling any fear. Courage is feeling, inside you, you're screaming out, oh my God, don't do this. Your instincts are saying, get the hell away from that cage, or don't go to training. And courage is acknowledging those feelings and going to do it anyway because it serves a higher purpose. And that's what that whole samurai archetype embodies. And for me, that's what I've gotten out of martial arts and out of competing, because there were times, man, when I was driving during the final couple weeks of fight camp at Full Circle, where I was driving to training already like trashed, and we were sparring that night, and I knew that it would be
painful.
It would be, yes, for lack of a better word, painful.
Yeah.
And I remember having that inner dialogue between those two, you know, the natural inclination, the flee inclination, you know, get out of there, protect yourself, don't do it. And there's all kind of rationalizations that your mind will start to fabricate to convince you of that. But if you have set for yourself a higher purpose and you're doing this for a reason, then you can overcome that. And that's what true courage is.
Yeah. And I think that shows in a lot of things. You know, a lot of the times we're fearful of things because we fail to understand them, right? I think fear is a natural emotion because we fail to understand. So when I'm fearful of somebody else or we don't like somebody else, it's because we probably don't understand them very well. We don't understand them well enough to actually put ourselves in their shoes and understand what is their perspective? How are they seeing these things? And so that fear is a natural response because it's the fight or flight response. And I think one of the things that you get out of putting yourself in those difficult situations over and over and over again is getting accustomed to that fear, right? You don't always like it, right? But you get used to knowing that, hey, I'm going to be feeling these feelings. And once you acknowledge and you bite down and you get through it, the growth that you experience is probably far greater than if you never put yourself in that position.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say this to anybody that does train martial arts but doesn't do any sort of competition. The growth that you get out of competition, it takes your martial arts to a different level. And for some schools, they might not do competitions. They might have a grading instead, right? And that grading might be very rigorous and the training might be very rigorous. And the whole point of a grading is to actually give you that almost like that feeling of doing a competition without doing a competition. So, you know, I would treat personally, I like to look at every competition like a mini grading, right? So you look at it like from that perspective, and then it's like that should be encouraging to actually just go and try again and go and try again and go and try again. And you can even apply that mindset to training as well. So depending on your training partners, you know, if you're all on the same page and you've got that, and that's the culture, right? If the culture is that, hey, yeah, like we can go hard and still be friends and still love each other and all that. And part of the reason why we're going hard is because we don't want to get away with bullshit, right? So with certain people you can do that, but you don't go and do that to the newcomer. You don't go and do that with somebody that you haven't sparred with, 100 times, right? So I think that's the balancing act from that perspective. I think, let's try and wind it all back because I always like to start from the beginning and just to give people the better understanding of who you are as a person. So where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Foxground, New South Wales, and Foxground is it's not even a village size, but it's tucked away in this nice little valley near Gerringong and Kiama for any of your Australian listeners. But yeah, my parents moved there when I was born, and I lived there with my older brother. It was a very classical kind of rural upbringing in the sense of just being able to wander through boundless fields, going exploring waterfalls and things like that, and reflecting back on it like a super lucky experience growing up there. And yeah, growing up with an older brother as well, being teased and tormented by him, I think also probably spurred this later desire in life that I had for martial arts. We would always play with sticks and swords and samurais and pretend to be, warriors of all different descriptions. And my dad was also very big into books and I guess the thinking pursuit and the intellectual side of things, and so I was reading from a young age. Always loved writing, and yeah, that's led up to the current day where I continue to write all the time about all manner of things, and also within the context of my current PhD studies. But it was a combination of boyish experiences outside with my brother, roaming around, bashing each other up, and then also being allowed the creative freedom to, write and to read. And for that, I'm always very appreciative of my parents. I think they did an awesome job during those, foundational years.
So do you remember what were your parents doing for work at that stage of your life?
They had they were running a business, and the business actually wasn't going so well when we were younger. And so my mother, when she was in Germany, she was a teacher, and she decided to pick teaching back up, and my dad was also teaching at TAFE during the time.
Okay.
So yeah, that was another reason. You know, they're both very learned people, very ethical people as well. That's one thing that I like. If I got the love of learning from my father, then I think from my mother I got a very strong ethical compass, which, I'm super grateful for.
Yeah. Okay. And so then did you go to school in that area as well? So primary school?
Yeah, I went to Berry Public School, which is in a nearby town, and high school at Bomaderry High School, which was a pretty rough experience. Looking back on it now, in hindsight, there were definitely a lot of memories there that were quite traumatic in a lot of ways. And then in the final 2 years of high school, I did at Kiama High School, so another school.
Let's go through some of those. So at Berry Public School, so as a kid, you know, in primary school, you'd probably describe yourself as, you know, you're into reading, writing, but also into all the playing and the, you know, the rough housing and that kind of thing. When you went to high school at Bomaderry, you know, what was that experience for you? So I guess, you know, what sort of groups did you hang around with, and I guess how did that sort of fit in for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I got to high school, I think I was someone who, as I was mentioning to you, I was into reading and writing, and I've always had a deep love of different Asian cultures, Japanese culture, Chinese culture, and so I was into these different things that not normally appreciated as being the norm. And when I came into year 7, I had long hair and things like this, and I wasn't quite attuned to, you know, for example, I wasn't at the age of chasing girls yet. I think I was just a little bit developmentally wise, maybe a bit naive compared to some of my classmates. I just wasn't really getting a grip of, you know, the mainstream way of thinking in that year. But what happened was, going through that process, you know, the cruel reality of waking up to, like the interests that I have aren't necessarily shared, and in fact they're considered quite weird and absurd. By the time I was in year 8, I'd changed rapidly in terms of assimilating to the dominant culture there, assimilating to the dominant things that people were interested in, whether that be like bodyboarding or surfing. Like I picked up one of those, I started skating, cut my hair. So gradually, as a lot of kids I think experience in high school, is the suppression of their inner nature, which, you know, hopefully they get back in contact with after they finish high school, but some people don't. But thankfully, after I finished high school, I was able to reconnect with that, and you know, those boyish childish dreams of being like a warrior and playing around found a healthy expression in martial arts. Yeah.
Okay. So then, from you mentioned bullying before. Was that in high school, or what was that?
That was both in high school and in primary school. And it was interesting. Like one of the primary, I actually had this revelation just in the past year. But one of the primary guys that bullied me in primary school and in high school, he, you know, there were some memories that I have of just being tackled from behind and dumped on my head by him for no reason, and just being so overwhelmed and so unsure as to why he did what he did. Like there was no real reason for what he did. I think that his own home life was quite tumultuous, and he suffered his own forms of abuse. So it's not like I hold this against him, but there was also an aspect of admiration that I had for this bully that complicated, I guess, the things that he was doing to me. Like,
so would you have classified him as a friend?
I wouldn't classify him as a friend necessarily, but he's someone who had qualities that I aspired to. Like he didn't necessarily buy in all the time to like the mainstream thing that the other kids were doing in the year, right?
Yep.
And he was kind of aloof and cool while not being part of like the dominant groups either. And so there were qualities in him that I admired, I think, and that I aspired to, which made that relationship very, very confusing for me. But again, and I don't know, maybe we'd be able to talk about this, but there does seem to be a strong stream of anti-intellectualism in Australia that I think is derived from our colonial heritage, but also, tall poppy syndrome, just a general repudiation of different ideas. And for example, I saw this guy about a year after I'd graduated high school, and I was at university then.
Yep.
And when I started university in 2013, that's when I started learning Chinese. So it's been 9 years since then. And I remember we saw this guy at the movies. I was with a bunch of my friends, and we saw him then. He was asking us like what we're doing, and people were describing what they were doing. And then I said, "Oh, I'm learning Chinese." And he said, "Oh yeah, that'd be right." And that is just so. That just epitomizes the kind of bullying that hurt me the most, I feel like, in high school and primary school. Because I remember, experiences of listening to like, I don't know, J-rock or some other music that I was interested in from different cultures, listening to that on the bus, for example, and a girl puts in one of my headphones, says, "Oh, what are you listening to?" Puts it in, and then just turns around and cascades me and says, "Look, this guy's listening to all this weird, Asian shit." And so, I don't know what your experience has been like of that, but for me, it's been a pervasive counterforce, I guess, when it comes to pursuing the interests that I want to pursue.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that, right? Like in the sense that sometimes it's environment. So, okay, let me try and put this in a cultural context, right? So a lot of Asian cultures have the concept of feng shui, right? Mm-hmm. And so feng shui, when you hear, like, there's that ad where somebody was talking about, feng shui, mate, feng shui, right? Like, we make a bit of a joke about it, right? But I guess I view these things as being lenses in how we interpret the world, right? And so I think when you think about religion, when you think about the political spectrum, when you think about anything that has a worldview, right? So any kind of ism, right, is a worldview, and in essence, it's essentially just a lens for you to try and interpret what's going on around you. So in feng shui, they would talk about the concept of heaven, earth, and man. So tian di ren, heaven, earth, and man. And one of the reasons why feng shui is so pervasive in Asian culture is because there's an element that, and whether you believe in determinism or it's free will, right, whichever way, feng shui's sort of got all your bases covered. Because if you think of heaven, earth, and man, the heaven part is, basically they say on the day that you're born, at the time you're born, blah, 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 there's a whole roadmap of what your life is, sort of, the direction that it's going to go. Which is why, there would be people who might be really into this and choose to have a C-section at a specific time, to have their baby born at a specific time, because the readings of this is actually really, really good. And so that's the heaven part of it. The man part of it is, what are your individual decisions? So what do you do that may influence your life, right? So as an example, it could be your interests. It could be choosing what subjects you enjoy, what you like to pursue. It could be choosing your friends, right? And then there is the earth part of it, which is your environment. And so what feng shui is actually about is trying to set your environment up so that you have the best chance at influencing the direction of your life. Because if you think about these three things each being a third, you ain't going to change the heaven part, right? The day that you're born is the day that you're born, the time that you're born, whatever it is, it's set in stone, right? So you cannot influence that. The only things that you can actually control is that 33% of your life, which is your personal choices, and the 33% of your life, which is your environment. Now, for some people, they can't change that 33%. If you're a young kid and you're born into a horrible situation at home, it's very difficult to change that at a young age, right? You can only start to work on that when you get to an older age, and you can start to fend for yourself and take some control of that situation, right? But I think, there's merit in that thinking, in that, yes, you have to accept that there is 33% of your life that you will never be able to change. But you still have 66% that you can control. I think they're pretty good odds, right? I think relatively speaking, they're pretty good odds. So, fitting that into how you sort of interpret those things when you reflect back on it. Like, some people have interests that other people don't have, right? And that's the beautiful thing about people, is that we're all different. We all have different interests. We all have different fascinations. And I like, and hence why I love martial arts so much, is because, you know, it's like a thread that sort of connects people. And I think, you know, one of the things in society is that we get stuck into this tribalistic perspective that this is, you know, our tribe. You know, so whether it's, you know, if you go back to martial arts back in the day where it used to be the karate guys were karate guys, the jiu-jitsu guys are jiu-jitsu guys, the boxers, and, you know, nobody really mixed and matched. And now those walls are coming down, right? And I think it's the same thing, you know, when it came to when we were in high school, right? There's different groups. People have an affinity towards one group until the point that maybe at some point they might feel ostracized by that group because perhaps some of their interests don't fully align, right? We see this in progressive narratives and things like that as well. So, you know, I think I think one way to look at it is just to think about that everybody has their own individualistic ideas, right? And to be accepting of whatever they are, right? Like, and so as an example, the way I would sort of, you know, I sort of interpret your bully friend slash not friend is that, you know, unfortunately the lens that he views the world from is very narrow, right? So his perspective on how he's viewing things is like, you know, well, anything that doesn't make sense to me, well, that's the enemy, right? I don't understand this music, that's shit music. Or I don't understand that language, I've got no interest in that. And for those people, the only time that I think you can actually open up your worldview and change your lenses is by living in a different culture, right? And so, you know, I always talk about travel as being one of the best ways to mature and gain new perspectives. Because, and I'll give you an example, like I was doing a podcast with Brother Viknesh, who is a priest in training, and he was talking about Tamil culture, right? And basically, you know, when we think about, you know, Indian surnames, they could have really, really long surnames. And he was explaining to me that his surname isn't actually his surname, it's his father's name. He doesn't have a surname. Because in their culture, they only have a first name. They don't have a surname. And so when they come to Western countries and they have to have a surname, a lot of the times their surname is like, if you translate their surname, it's like, you know, Viknesh from the village in the mountains by the sea. Right, and that's why it's so long. It's because the surname is the Tamil words for in the mountains by the sea, right? And so for other people, you look at that surname and go, oh, this is ridiculous. Why have they got such a long surname, right? But I actually never knew that until I actually did that podcast with him, and I was like, wow, okay, so you guys don't have a surname. It's very different, right? Like, so it doesn't compute, right? Because we've never experienced that, right? But then, you know, when you start to talk to people and you take the time to understand, you know, what is different about them culturally, right? And so, you know, in some cultures, people always might comment that, hey, these people are really loud, right? And you go, why do they always talk so loud, right? And there's Chinese languages, like as an example, wénhuà, like Fujian, like what they speak dialects in Taiwan, the Taiwanese dialect or the dialect in Fujian province in China. Like when you hear it spoken, it sounds so rough, like people are arguing, but that's just the way the language sounds, right? So there's all these things that sort of pervade how we, what lens we view the world in, and only by adding more lenses can we then, you know, sort of cut down the noise, right? Because you sort of have to see that, hey, okay, if I view the world with this lens, I can't see anything if I put this other lens over it.
Yep.
Right? It'd be like having a lens that is almost black and then adding another almost black lens over the top. You can't see anything, right? So you need to actually then go, okay, maybe I need to lighten that lens a little bit and not look so heavily through that lens. And, you know, in a lighter shade of grey, now I can actually see some colour, right?
For sure, yeah. I feel as if learning another language really helps that process. You know, it allows you to take some crucial steps outside the environment that is the environment that you only know, which is your home language, your home culture, and to turn around and look at it in a objective light and think like, is everything in this legitimate? Like, should I be trusting everything, all the social norms and all the rules and all the ideas that my culture propagates? Can it be possible that this one culture has gotten everything right? Or is there value in learning from and coming to appreciate ideas from other cultures. And yeah, the other difficult thing though is I feel as if some things remain inaccessible, irrespective of how much you might learn about the language after the fact. So say, for example, myself learning it starting when I was 18 and I'm now 27. And it's definitely changed my worldview in a lot of different ways. One of the big things that has changed is the appreciation for my parents by virtue of the importance of, filial piety in Asian societies, and in particular in China, the idea of, honoring your ancestors' tradition, but also respecting and venerating in a way your parents and the sacrifice that they made in raising you, which is not so strongly emphasized in Australia. I mean, you don't have to look very far. Look at where we're sticking our old people, like straight into old people's homes, where if COVID has shown anything, it's that's prison-like conditions in some of these places. And so it's definitely given me a new appreciation for my parents and for my sense of responsibility to them in a way that I think is lacking in some ways in a country like Australia. But then again, there's pros and cons to where you fall on this spectrum, right? Because then, Chinese people would look at the situation in Australia and say that's immoral, but then people from Australia might look at the situation in China and say, well, that's ridiculously controlling. The parent and the child are two individual, entities. The parent shouldn't dictate what the child chooses. So obviously there's trade-offs in any kind of approach, but there is such immense value in being able to hold both ideas in your head at the same time. And you can only achieve that if, for example, you travel extensively. And the thing about learning another language is that you're coming at the person that you're engaging with at their level. Like you're trying to come at them like at their level. And that's what people don't appreciate. Speaking English as a first language, whether it's in the USA, Britain or Australia, is that it's not just about learning another language. It's about coming to people like your equals, because you're coming to them with their own language. And there's a lot of value in that. And there's some things that you won't hear, you won't learn about, and that they won't tell you, and that they can't tell you. They don't have the words for it unless you make that effort. And yeah, it's interesting because then there's also some things that I would that when I talk to my contacts in China, I'm engaged for my PhD. I interviewed 30 people throughout China. I've had upwards of 200 conversations with people all throughout China now. And there's things that I would talk to them about and I would agree with them on that were I speaking English, I wouldn't necessarily agree with, just because the vocabulary is different. There's, in Chinese, there's this expression, Yǔyán是wénhuà的载体, which means that language is the epitome of culture, right? You can't separate the culture from the language. And that's so true when you consider something like measure words, right? So there's been studies that have been done in linguistics. There was this hypothesis that came out, I think in the 1970s, by these two gentlemen called Sapir and Worf. It was called the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And essentially what they were postulating is that patterns in speech and because we are thinking in the language that we think in the language that we're born into, that those patterns in thought and patterns in language encourage actual ways in which you think. So let me give you an example. In Chinese, we know there's measure words, right? So if I is one and ren is person, I can't just say I ren, I have to say I ge ren, where ge is the measure word. And so what they've done is they've gotten, there's been experimental studies that cross-cultural studies where they've looked at, for example, American English speakers, and they've looked at Chinese speakers, and they asked them to group items in accordance with which belong together and which don't belong together, right? And so you have, for example, in one they gave, you had like a pencil, a pen, and like a long wooden broom handle, okay? And the American English speakers grouped the wooden pencil and the pen together, right? Because they served the service of writing, right? And the wooden broomstick didn't really do anything to fit into that narrative. Whereas the Chinese speakers, now I'm actually not sure what the measure word is, but the Chinese speakers grouped the wooden pencil and the wooden broomstick together, and they cancelled the pen out because they're made of wood and there's a measure word for like long wooden objects that uses the same measure word. And so what that illustrates is that patterns in the language encourage your worldview and how you engage with the world and how you view certain relationships. And the important thing to stress is that worldview is not accessible to you unless you speak that language. Yep. And unless, because like for me, I would still group the pen and the pencil, right? Because I was born in Australia and those patterns in language encourage that pattern of thinking, right? That taxonomic kind of thinking. But what that indicates is that there's certain ways of viewing and being in the world that you can't access unless you were born into a certain culture. And for politicians, for diplomats, for anyone engaging with people from different cultures, like we need to appreciate that, because it's currently the source of very gross levels of misunderstanding.
I agree with that. I think, the way that the Chinese language is structured in terms of numbers is partially the reason why Chinese speaking kids are better at maths, right? Because from a young age, it's so easy to put numbers together. Whereas, so as an example, when you count 1 to 10, if you can count 1 to 10, you can pretty much count to 99, right? Straight away, right? Like it's because you don't need to know that once you get past 10, it's not 1-1, or 10-1, I should say, right? Because in Chinese, and then when you go to 10 shi, and then it becomes shi. So then, it comes very easy up to 99, where you can put it all together, and then before you need to learn a new word, which is ibai, right? Whereas in English, you get to 10, and here you go again. Now you gotta learn 11. Now you gotta learn 12. Now you gotta learn 13, and then you get to 19, and it's not like there's a logical progression to go to 20, right? So you're always learning the new numbers every 10 basically, as opposed to getting to almost 100 before you have to learn a new word. So I agree with that. I think, language is so important. I always say, especially when it comes to communicating, I think the difference between a good negotiator and a poor negotiator is all about language, right? So the terminology that we use, because in English, this is the common one that I always use, if we use the word contract as an example, most people have a negative association with the word contract, because a contract is a binding agreement. If I said I'm going to bind you, right, you'd probably go, "Oh, I don't really want to be bound."
Well, in some contexts,
right? In some contexts, maybe, right? So, but
you
generally
said we
speaking,
keep this PG rated, mate.
No, it's a free for all.
Okay.
Yeah, but like it's one of those things where those little differences, these little nuances just make or break the discussion. And I think, a common way that we, if I use the word agreement as opposed to contract, right? Even though in essence, we're asking for the same thing, right? We want to have an agreement. That's why we're signing a contract. But if I say, let's sign an agreement, then basically by virtue of the word agreement, we agree. So it becomes a lot easier to then use that terminology as opposed to, here, sign the contract. Sounds like I'm forcing you to sign the contract, right? But let's sign an agreement. Sounds like, okay, we're both on the same page, so it's really easy to sign it off. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. Something actually came to mind when you were talking about, the differences in counting and numbers between different languages. There's a book called, a very famous book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Have you heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, it came out in 2008. Malcolm Gladwell, to the best of my knowledge, is a psychologist. He's written a number of books, but this one came out and he's essentially explaining the phenomena of genius or outliers. Why is it that there's people or groups that somehow appear superhuman in the fact that they can do all these things, or they have an amazing intellect, or they're able to accomplish these feats that no, mortal human could accomplish? And essentially he goes through and he's debunking a lot of these ideas that we have about people who are truly successful in it, and showing how a lot of the time it boils down to opportunities that they've received, the environment that they're born into, and the like. And one of the reasons that he had a chapter in there where he was talking about the differences between, for example, Chinese students' proclivity for mathematics versus people from other countries. And what he was arguing was that you can actually trace but also it wasn't just about the mass, but it was more about, this truku, this idea of, eating your bitterness, getting on with work and just striving hard all day, every day, which is a very strong mentality in China. You see it now in the 996 work culture that is so strong that the government is now having to instigate regulations to try and get these companies to stop working people to the bone. But what he was saying is that, for thousands of years along the Pearl River Delta, the main crop that was grown was rice. And because rice was such a staple, unlike crops like wheat and barley that were grown in Europe, rice is something that you can grow all year round. It's something that requires constant care and attentiveness. And it also requires quite a good understanding of, because you need to constantly irrigate rice. For people that don't know, rice isn't grown directly into the soil. It's grown on top of a clay base. And that base is constantly irrigated. So you need to be very attuned to the conditions in your field, how big your field is, what the boundaries that it backs up to in terms of your neighbors and things like this. And the other difference, because then there were crops in Europe that, like I mentioned, wheat and barley, that come seasonally, right? There's half of the year where you're working hard, and then in winter you're not doing squat anything really. And at the same time, you have this feudal system in medieval Europe, for example, where if you're a serf, if you're a peasant, then you're giving, the majority or pretty much all of your earnings to the dominant lord in that area. And in China, it was a little bit different. I mean, obviously it changed in different dynasties, but it was a little bit different. Usually there was a bit of leeway. So if you were a peasant, you would be... you would have to give some of your yield or some of the money you got from your yield to the respective landowner, but you could also keep a portion for yourself. So anything over a target number you could keep for yourself. So there was this incentive
to work really hard,
to work super, super hard, be constantly working year round, because it's a crop that you could do that with, be constantly attuned and switched on. And Malcolm Gladwell's argument in Outliers is that has also contributed to this longer historical trajectory and cultural trajectory of working hard, of being industrious, being good with numbers and the like. So interesting stuff. Eh?
See, I find this thing, so that that Chinese mindset or the Asian mindset of working really, really hard. So I can see that in my own parents, right? So they came to Australia. My parents were originally, so I guess, Chinese background, but my grandparents from my father's side were in Singapore, my mother's side in Malaysia. My parents met when they were studying in New Zealand. My dad couldn't get a visa in New Zealand, so they ended up coming to Australia. And, they had their own businesses. They worked, long hours, every day. And because their perspective was that they wanted to provide the opportunities for me and my brother that obviously they didn't have. And the best way to do that was to obviously make money and have income, right? And so, I'm very fortunate that I had parents that made that sacrifice, so that although I didn't get as much time with them growing up from that perspective because they were always working, I'm so fortunate in my position to be able to spend all this time with my children because of the work that they did, right? And so I think it's the old Einstein quote that we stand on the shoulder of giants, right? So that's part of the reason why I think Asian cultures really are so grateful to their parents and their ancestors and things like that. And sadly, I don't actually know much about my ancestry aside from my immediate parents. I never got to meet my grandfathers on either side of the family. I met my grandmother. I met both my grandmothers, but my grandmother on my mum's side passed away when I was after I probably only remember seeing her once or something. So, and with that, I think because I didn't have that opportunity to, and I don't think in Asian culture, you don't really sit down and talk to your parents about this kind of stuff. No. Right? And so, when I started this podcast, my goal was actually I wanted to sit down and do that conversation with my dad. And I learned so much from that conversation, right? And, I guess part of, me in doing this is to one day be able to pass that on to my kids so that if they ever get interested in it, they could actually go back and listen to it and try and understand a bit more about where they came from. But I think that sort of industrious nature, and why I bring this up, because I always find it really interesting, when you think about, I follow a few of the Asian American style news accounts on Instagram, and I find the perspectives really, really interesting because it's like you're applying this this Western perspective of equality over, you know, the quietness of just do your work, shut up, and get on with life, right? And so we saw like, and I understand both perspectives of it, obviously, because I grew up in Australia as a Western, you know, country as well. That we sort of, you know, we want to be able to celebrate that, hey, there's now more, you know, Asian faces on screen. So as an example, Shang-Chi, you know, as a movie, you know, you know, for young Asian children, they've got a role model that's a superhero, right? And we want to celebrate those things. But at the same time, you know, I'm a bit torn. I always find it very conflicting for me because, you know, I always felt like, you know, the accolades will come, right? You just shut up, do your work, shut up, do your work. And I don't want that narrative of, oh, we want to celebrate these things to take away that people actually worked really fucking hard on that movie, right? So, you know, credit to all the actors, the stunt people, all the cast and everything. Like, people worked really fucking hard on that movie. You know, I spent one day on set. It was a 15-hour day, right? And you know, like the stunt team. So the like in the scene that I was there for, the stunt team was, you know, having the guy that is the stunt double for Wong smashing him into the cage like 5 times. Like, you know, like that shit's not easy, right? It looks great on scene, on set, on screen, but you know, like there's so much hard work that goes into that, right? And I think like, you know, that's where I get a bit conflicted, and I haven't really worked out what my own perspective on that is, because, you know, yes, I think it's great that we can celebrate these things, but I think it's like, okay, yep, let's move on. Like, let's just get back into hard work. Yeah,
man. And for me, you know, going to the Chinese context now, it is really difficult for young people in China at the moment because they have the expectation of 996 at the same time that, you know, we're dealing with the, you know, one child policy generation now that is in adulthood or in decision making positions now, and suddenly they realize, oh my God, I'm working 996. My parents are getting old. I have to care for my parents. Property prices, you know, in the major cities are so jacked up that I can't afford any of this. And it's just so overwhelming that it's led to this movement of tangping or lying flat. And it's this movement of young Chinese people that are essentially saying, look, I'm buying out of the rat race. Like, the other thing people fail to recognize is there's another expression in Chinese that refers to people's young people, and it's who has, you know, the heaviest burden in society, and people will say like school children. And it's so true. When I was living in Shanghai, I was doing some tutoring of this 9-year-old, girl, and she, you know, would go to school at like 7 a.m, get home at 5 p.m, do an hour of tutoring, English tutoring with me, and then have another like 2 hours of tutoring with a Chinese tutor. She would then be doing ballet and piano, because whatever you can do or you can give to your child that will distinguish them from like however 100 million other children they're then going to be competing with in like the Gaokao down the track, the better. And so parents are so stressed, realizing they have to invest all of their time and energy and resources into building the capacities of one kid. That kid has all of that on their shoulders. And, you know, the Gaokao and these exams are brutal, and the kid wears that all the way up until university. So a lot of them burn out at university, and they don't have developed a love for a love for learning, because it's something that's just been
forced on them.
Forced on them. Since, you know, you
can't pursue your own passions.
Exactly.
That's one of the things that I really admire about Australia, is from that perspective. When I think back on, you know, the opportunities that I've been afforded in life are amazing, right? And I think to any child that gets to grow up in Australia, we are so fortunate that we get to have all these amazing opportunities. All it comes down to is, what are you willing to do? Right? Because and I was doing a podcast with one of my primary school friends, Chris, who is now he's living in Hong Kong again, but originally from Hong Kong, came here when he was young, and decided to go back to Hong Kong. And I asked him, you know, why do you want to stay in Hong Kong? And he goes, you know, being an Asian guy in Australia, like the opportunities are limited. And I sort of thought about that, and I go, you know, I've had a fantastic career, you know, in the automotive industry, and I said to him, like, I would think that anybody that took or did the work that I did would be able to achieve the same things that I achieved. But are you prepared to do the work? Right? Like, I'm talking about, you know, I studied 2 degrees. I did engineering and law. I was at the same time I was doing engineering and law. I was working as an apprentice mechanic, going to TAFE 1 day a week, working practically full time, doing studies at night, passed uni, passed TAFE, finished all that, a year early because my brother sort of took his time with uni and finished his degree late. And I don't say that in a bad way. It's just because at the time, I had some family pressures, right? I had things at home that my parents weren't getting along and things, the home situation wasn't good. So I wanted to get out into the workforce as quickly as possible, right? But then, when I think back on that, even though they were the toughest times of my life, that allowed me to grow so much. Like excuse me, it pushed me like well beyond any sort of level that I could think of. And at the time, like I didn't really think about, am I being pushed? I just thought about, I've got no choice, right? This is my only choice. My only choice is to work my fucking ass off. And at the end of it, like it paid off for me, right? So I feel like, we all have those opportunities, right? Because I guess, if you think about it, and if, there are people like my friend Chris who say I'm an outlier, right? And there'd probably be a lot of people that say, oh, but Johnny, that's you, right? And I've always sort of grappled with this because I've had plenty of people say that to me in my career, right? But Johnny, that's you. And it's like, so what if it's me? It could be you too. It could be anyone. But what do you really want to achieve? Like, what are you working for? Right? And so, I guess now I'm in this weird sort of phase because I'm not in the automotive industry anymore, right? So, not by choice, but, through certain things that have happened, I'm not able to work in the automotive industry at the present moment.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying, like about people saying, oh, that's you, Johnny, and people do have a tendency to do that. They pedestal people and say, you're unique or your circumstances are unique. That absolves them from responsibility. And then the other thing people like to do as well is to point at all the problems in the world and the situation that they're in and to bemoan that or to criticize that. And that's actually one of the big criticisms that Jordan Peterson has of this new woke movement and of, the state of intellectual life at institutions, not here in Australia, but in the US and Canada, is that there's a lot of encouragement of people to bemoan what's wrong with capitalism or what's wrong with liberal democracy or to, force people to grieve and feel bad for, colonialism and things like that. And what he's saying is like, at the end of the day, you need to take personal responsibility for your life, and no one can do that by you. Yeah. And are there things that are horrible and wrong in the world that we should fight for and fight for the good? Definitely, but it's like you should first do that in your own context, because then things have a tendency to to move further afield in terms of your waves of influence when you can fix up your own life. And it's a very, very powerful message, but he's been lambasted for that as well. Or it's been lost within the throes of some of his other views, which is unfortunate because I think it's a very important view for people to consider now.
It's the old circle of influence, circle of concern. If you concern yourself with all of these things that are outside of your actual influence, what you're creating is anxiety for yourself, right? You're inundating yourself with all these worries and issues that are actually out of your control, right? Whereas if you just focus on what is it that you can actually physically influence, okay, well, what are you doing on those things? So as an example, for your personal health, okay, what are you doing for your personal health? What are you doing for your mental health, right? And I guess we can talk about that as well because you've obviously got the shirt on, and so that's a sort of minor segue. But let's talk about that an initiative because I saw this thing on Instagram and you were doing this walk, and it was for mental health, and it was in relation to men's mental health. And suicide, I'm guessing?
Yeah, men's mental health and suicide, that's right.
So talk to me about it.
Yeah, sure. So I am associated with a men's mental health charity called Talk to Me Bro. And my affiliation with them really started about a year and a half ago. It would have been 2020 in about October. So after at the first lockdown of COVID here in Australia. And there was this event down in the Snowy Mountains. It was like a men's mental health retreat. And there were... The reason I was attracted to it is because I'm well into things like, the Wim Hof method, so breath work and cold exposure, into all of these kinds of things. So I'll do whatever it is to biohack, so to speak. So I went down there for that reason. But when I got there, there were guys there for all different kinds of reasons. But I remember being in a session where Jack and Luke, who are two of my good mates, shout out to Jack and Luke, but they're some of the main guys behind Talk to Me Bro. And Jack and Luke were explaining some of the statistics in Australia and essentially describing the numbers of, people committing suicide is greater than the number of people losing their life in car accidents and automobile accidents and things like this. And it got to a point where they were saying the statistics about people that had thought about suicide within the past week. And so then they asked everyone there, who has thought about killing themselves this past week? And a third of the room shot their hands up.
Wow.
And there were guys there that when they admitted, like we would have sessions where, it would just go around in a circle and everyone would say something or contribute. And there were, guys there that were saying, I didn't really want to come to this. My friends kind of forced me. I've always been intimidated being around other guys in this kind of environment because it's an only guys retreat. And, other people would contribute similar things. And you could see like the way that these guys carried themselves, they were pretty uncomfortable, not too willing to open up and talk. And through the process of a couple of days of going on these intense hikes, getting into like the freezing cold water, like it was winter, the water was coming straight from the glaciers. It was excruciatingly cold. And then that in combination with breathwork sessions, like group breathwork sessions of 30 guys or so in one room with drums and all kinds of things, and going through those things together and allowing everyone acknowledging, that people were suffering there, led to the creation of this insane environment in the sense that it was non-judgmental, compassionate, and it was just such a transformative experience. And there were things that happened that I won't disclose, but there were things that happened where after the retreat, those same guys were completely different. And they would say that experience changed my life.
Yep.
The experience of having an empathetic circle of men, no judgment, no status, no roles. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what reason you're here for, but you know that, there's going to be guys around here that care about you a lot and that are willing to hear what you've been through. Because another problem was a lot of these guys had suffered traumas and issues that they'd never talked about to anyone.
Yep.
And that's the thing. We don't give men a space to talk freely about what they're dealing with because it's seen as a sign of weakness. And unfortunately, that's still a major norm, but it's what Talk to Me Bro is trying to, remedy and put forward. It's trying to break this stigma of saying that, in fact, to take a line from Brené Brown, vulnerability isn't weakness, it's immense courage and it's immense strength. Like if you have to admit to people what you're going through, that's way harder than just holding on to something internally. Like, and you'll realize that your path to retribution, your path out of the misery that you're in, is by admitting what's happened or conveying how you're feeling to other people. That's the first immediate step. Even after, admitting that to an empathetic circle, that is the very first step in recovery and the healing process. And we don't give men the space to get to that first step. And so, that's why I'm a very avid supporter of Talk to Me Bro and what they're doing, because I think it's incredibly important with suicide, mental health issues going up around the world now.
Absolutely. And, lockdown, I think, and COVID has exacerbated a lot of those issues. I had part of the reason I started this podcast, and I talk about him a lot, I guess because he's part of the reason I started the podcast. My friend Adrian committed suicide 2 years ago. Well, it's 3 years ago now, 2019, just after Easter. And, we had my friend Ivan and we had dinner with him on Easter Monday, and then 5 days later, he offed himself. And, we always, you think about, what could you have said, what could you have done, and you really don't know what somebody is going through to make that choice, right? And some people say, oh, sometimes it's spur of the moment. Other times it could be premeditated. You don't really know, and it's so hard to open up that conversation. Like how are you supposed to ask somebody? Oh, are you thinking about this?
Right.
And so there's no real way normally in normal conversation. And I think that's one of the other things that I think is remiss is that a lot of nowadays, conversation isn't deep. It's all very shallow and surface level. We don't really get into the nitty gritty of a conversation. When was the last time you sat down and spoke to somebody for, a couple of hours? Right. And had just like a one-on-one conversation to really, cut through all the bullshit, like I think, we always talk about, how's family and how's this or how's work. And we talk about these things, but we don't really talk about, like what are the real things that are sort of troubling you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's an inheritance of, the post-war generation. I actually think that the baby boomer generation did an incredible job raising, for example, my generation, because my parents, my granddad was in Germany during the time of World War II. When he was 18, he ran away from an incredibly brutal home environment where he was maliciously attacked and denigrated by his father, and he ran away and he joined the army, and so he was fighting for the Nazis during World War II. Was in a ton of battles, got captured by the Russians, was in like a Russian gulag. And on my dad's side of the family, like his grandparents also suffered like immense horrors during World War II that they never spoke about. And that kind of stoicism, while, I think in a bygone era, it was valued and cherished as the way that you go about being a responsible man and a responsible person, is that you bottle up everything you have inside and you carry on, right? You carry on regardless. And I feel as if that mentality led to a lot of problems when they were raising their own kids and how close emotionally their own kids felt to them. And, the intergenerational trauma is very real and it does have a cascading effect. You would only need to talk to people from Australia's Indigenous populations to know that that's very true, that there's this intergenerational trauma that lingers on in the collective psyche of people. And so, you were talking before about this. One of the things I like most about Talk to Me Bro is that they're very specific. They have sessions where they go into different workplaces and they're very specific about, what it is that you should and shouldn't say when someone comes to you with an issue. And it might not actually be that they have this issue, right? It could be that you recognize that something's amiss with your friend and that it's actually you that has to bring it up, right? And, you could start by saying that the person, you can recognize that they're struggling and that everyone's concerned about them and stuff like that. But it does boil down to this point where you have to ask them, have you thought about killing themselves? And then there can be a moment of pause where it does come out and they admit it to themselves for the first, because often they haven't admitted it to themselves. It's just been varied thoughts in their head. And then when they put it to words, like that is the crucial moment. Like, and particularly in the age where we have distractions on our phone and things like that, that is the moment where you have to really be there for them. And, if you're not actually in person or it's over the phone or something like that, you have to be super attentive to that person at that point in time and, to try and go to them wherever they are, to be with them, but to treat it seriously and to really recognize that what they're going through is real. It's not a fabrication. It's not like you saying, oh, you have to suck it up, mate, or anything like that, right? It's coming from a position of genuine compassion and empathy for the person that you're engaging with. But a lot of the times it does take the friend that is sensitive to these issues to bring it up to the person and say, I can see that you're struggling, man. Is there anything that I can do to help? And it is difficult. It is difficult because, like, I know that people have this idea of you don't want to be too, invasive and stuff. Yeah. But if you're genuine friends, if you're real friends, like I believe,
you got to be able to have these hard conversations.
Yeah, if you're real friends, you're genuine friends or family, that they will know, if not in the day at the moment, down the track, they will know that came from a position of genuine care and concern.
Yeah. It's such a hard, like even when Ivan and I, we had dinner with him, like we were talking to each other afterwards, and we were like, did we miss something? Like that's what we kept thinking, did we miss something? And we sort of, we couldn't really come up with anything that sort of was like a red flag.
Yeah.
Right. It was just, it's one of those things where, of course, if I could do it all over again, I would have approached it very differently, and I think, for anyone that is, has a friend that they're worried about, or, might even be the person that's in that position, right? When you were talking before about, admitting, acknowledging that there's something there, I always, and this is something that it's just sort of become part of who I am, right? Like, I think, you need to wear your L's, wear your losses, on your sleeve, and the better that you are at acknowledging, how these things might be impacting you and how you're feeling about it is the best way to then actually taking steps to address it, right?
Exactly.
Because it's like the old, if you keep burying things under the rug, at some point that rug is going to be lumpy and not very nice.
Yeah, or it'll explode in unexpected ways.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So, the best way is you got to sort of, clear house and actually, I've become a lot more, I would say, a lot more thoughtful in terms of, actually sitting down and writing down my thoughts on certain things.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that, 10 years ago I would have been like that. 10 years ago you sort of just, whatever, and you just sort of move on. Now, like, especially when it came to having hard conversations from the work context, I would sit there and gather my thoughts and spend a good half an hour thinking about things, and writing down, what am I trying to achieve as a result of this, right? So I really would sit there with literally a pen and paper and draw a line down the middle and start writing what are all these things and what's my flow in terms of logic. And then, not only that, after I'd brain dumped everything, I'd sort of, go and walk away, have a drink, have a cup of water or something like that, go to the bathroom, come back, and then actually just let's review it, right? Because are there things that might be inconsistent here? Are there things that I need to adjust for my messaging that, because whenever you're having those hard conversations, so, thinking about it from a work context and a coaching perspective, right? A lot of people view, a performance review from a work context as a bad thing, right? Like if we're here to talk about your performance, people go, am I doing a shit job, right? It may not be that we're doing a shit job. It could be that we're just trying to do it better, right? And so that's how I would approach it. And I would think about, how am I going to make this person better, right? And achieve more and get more out of, what do they want in life? And, so I just think it's really important to have that ability to reflect and sit there with your thoughts.
Yes.
Do you do much in terms of journaling and things like that, or writing?
Yeah, man. I do a lot. And it goes through different phases, similar to how you periodize your training, like weight training or anything like that. I have a tendency to do things in blocks. So I'll get really obsessed with some kind of introspective practice, and then I'll move on to the next, or I'll integrate it in a lesser capacity. But practices of such as affirmations, writing out particular characteristics that you want to see in yourself. And, reciting those to yourself on a daily, regular basis. But what we were talking about before, either getting out the thoughts that are in my head to a friend, or even just writing them down, is super important, because that is the ability for you to recognize that they're just thoughts, right? If you never express your thoughts either in writing or written out, if you don't ever get them out from between your ears, you will end up believing that you are your thoughts. And this is the whole basis of cognitive behavioral therapy that was propagated by David Burns, rational emotive therapy that was propagated by Albert Ellis and Robert Harper, who are other psychologists. But essentially what they're saying is that states of depression are perpetrated by you feel crushed by the emotions that you're having, but the emotions are only a reflection of your state of thought, right? State of mind. If you have something catastrophic happen to you, you have a devastating breakup, you lose a loved one, you lose your job, it's natural to have a period where you're in grief and mourning over that.
Yep.
But if that continues any longer, you can become miserable in your own misery, right? You're miserable purely because of the fact that you're in misery, and your train of thoughts in that context become pivotal, right? And a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea of sitting with a therapist, is the therapist is looking for things in your way of thinking, right? When they ask you, like, why do you see yourself in that light? Or why do you view the relationship that you have with your sister in those terms, right? They're looking for things that they can point to and say, aha, is that a limiting belief, or where did that thought originate from, right? Where did that reaction originate from? Because people think that they are their thoughts, right? And this is something that meditation teaches you once you've practiced long enough, is it gives you that crucial space between your thoughts, or the recognition of your pattern of thought, and how you don't have to accept every thought that comes into your head, right? So many people beat themselves up because they have a ridiculous thought that comes out of nowhere, and they blame, and they blame themselves for it, and then that can get caught in a vicious cycle, and that's why writing things out or articulating yourself is very important. Otherwise, you can believe and get caught up in I am my thoughts, and that is a path towards catastrophe. But in the same breath, if you recognize that and then you incorporate practices like affirmations, writing out, desirable things that you want to see happen in your life, or desirable qualities that you want to see in yourself, if you do that long enough over a period of time, your brain will start looking for those things in your life, and you will naturally be you will start behaving and performing in line with those narratives. And it's not something that you have to do forever. Like, one of the benefits that I got from doing affirmations for about a year or so was that the stream of it's much easier to tap into that positive stream of consciousness, because now you have this bank of
positive thoughts,
phrases, ideas about yourself that you've seen affirmed in your own actions and your own behavior that you can always fall back on.
That's there's I can't remember what the term is for it, but it's like, when you're driving, right? So, and this is the example I would use. So when I was working for Mercedes, I noticed every Mercedes that was on the road, right? And you go, shit, there's a lot of Mercedes on the road, right? And then I changed to BMW, and then you start noticing every BMW on the road, and you go, there's a lot of BMWs on the road, right? But relatively speaking, compared to the amount of Toyotas and all these mainstream brands, there's not going to be as many, but you still manage to notice every single one that's coming out, because it's in your mind, right? You're thinking about it. And so I think it's the same way with our thoughts. So, one of the things that I did, started doing, in the last 5 years, was sort of like a gratitude practice. So almost, I guess, call it whatever you call it, prayer or gratitude practice. I'll think about things and I'd say, these are the things I'm thankful for, right? Not asking for anything, right? I'm just grateful that I have these things in my life, that, my kids are healthy, my marriage is great, my family life is wonderful, I'm grateful for all the opportunities I have in life. And I just, when I was driving home from work, that would be what I would think about. I'd think about, what are the things I'm grateful for today? And I feel like the more you look, just like looking for those Mercedes-Benz cars or the BMWs, right? The more you look for the positives, the more you see the positives, and the negatives are still there. The negatives could be the Toyotas running around, right? They're all on the road. But if you keep only paying attention to the positive things, the more you see those positive things, and they sort of, it creates an upward spiral.
As positive feedback loop.
Positive feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's like the premise of a lot of these, some of the most popular therapies today, is how do we get to change this person's thinking, because changing the person's thinking will have a flow-on effect in terms of the emotions that they feel and how they feel about the situation that they're in and things like that. And so, there's immense value in these different things. But for me, I've had a regular meditation practice now for probably the last 3.5 years.
So what do you do?
Again, I have this kind of periodized look where I get really interested in certain things for a while, and then once I've seen some improvement in those areas, I then will move on. But for me, it just started with focused attention meditation. So the classic focusing on your breath. And then there's also open awareness meditation, where you are paying attention to the sensations that arise in your body and the environment, kind of experiencing them as like a cloud of sensation almost. And doing that for around 2.5 years was incredibly beneficial in a lot of unexpected ways. And one of the biggest ones is that meditation increases the space between stimulus and response, right? So you're no longer just flying on autopilot when things happen, or even after the fact. So say you respond in a particular way, you will catch yourself and think, oh, wow, I responded to that out of, anger, or out of this emotion, or you can classify why you reacted in a certain way, which is, most people think they know what they're doing, but in reaction, they're reacting to traumas that they've had. They've reacted to past heartbreaks that they've had, to all of these things that they're unaware of, that are actually guiding and dictating how reactive they are at any one moment. And so, meditation for me increases that space between stimulus and response. And it's been shown, a sustained meditation practice contributes to increased grey matter in the amygdala, so the fear and aggression sides of the brains, and also strengthens the prefrontal cortex, right? So the ability for your brain or for you to make rational decisions, right? To take a step back and actually consider the implications of how you're going to act in any one moment. And those kinds of skills, I think, are very, very needed today. Particularly in the attention crisis that we're living in. But yeah, man, I am a big proponent of meditation, and I continue to meditate now. Today.
Oh, look, I think you're right. So I think a lot of people think about what is the first order consequence of something that they might do, and people view it very directly. It's like, okay, well, if I don't want this behavior, I need to approach it like this. But then we don't think about what is the second and third order consequence. Like, what is the precedent that we set by approaching this problem in this particular manner, right? That's one of the things that I think about a lot when it comes to parenting. I think about, with my kids, if I approach this problem in this way, is that going to, yes, it might make them stop doing whatever they're doing, but then what could potentially be the longer term consequence in terms of, okay, so when they have a problem, they're going to fix it with a hammer, as an example, fix it with violence as opposed to fixing it through, empathy and understanding, right? So these are the sort of things that I think, when your attention span gets smaller and smaller, we're just looking for the easy out. We're always looking for these silver panaceas or the silver bullets that are going to give us this amazing outcome when it's actually hard work, day in, day out, just the consistency of doing something to get you that outcome.
It is.
Right? So let's switch gears a little bit, because I want to talk about your tertiary studies, and I think it's really important because obviously you went and studied in China, you studied in Shanghai, right?
Yep, Shanghai.
And so, what was that experience like for you? So I guess prior to going to Shanghai, I'm guessing you had probably been overseas before, but never to China? Or?
Yeah, I'd been overseas. I had actually done a semester abroad previously in Denmark, which was a radically different experience. Equally awesome, but just a very different experience. And then prior to that, I'd done travel, but not in Asia, mostly in Europe.
Okay. So, let's talk about some of the travel experiences first. So when you did the Europe trip, was that just like a holiday?
I have done Euro trips, like classic Euro trips back in the day with like a few friends, 18, 19, just getting up to ridiculous stuff. But I'll save those stories because, they're not worth retelling. But when I was in Denmark, I was studying over there as well.
Okay.
And so whenever, I've always been very motivated to keep, and this is actually ties back into what we were saying about, the Australian culture of, you can pursue what you want to pursue kind of thing. I felt that after high school, I really realized, oh man, if I apply myself, I can actually do whatever I want to do. Like I can really achieve some things here and tangible. And martial arts showed me that as well. But it was at that time. And so I also had this equal wanderlust to get abroad. And so, living in Denmark was a fantastic experience. I was in Copenhagen, which is a beautiful city of about 1 million people. It's probably a bit more than that now, but just awesome city, can get to everywhere on a bike. Very clean environment, really interesting culture and things like that. And yeah, traveling around Europe was an equally gratifying experience. But yeah, when I came to China, man, to be honest, when I first arrived there, because what had happened was I'd studied Mandarin for about 2.5 years in Australia, and I was top of the class in my class, and they said, you're top of the class, you could get this scholarship to study in China. And I said, let's do it, because I saw a bunch of other people, if you did 2 years, you would get a minor in Mandarin. And I realized at 2 years, I was like, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. I could not engage in someone and talk about anything, or understand. Well, after 2 years in a classroom environment, man, to be honest, no, with needing to learn the tones, needing to learn the characters, it was, I could see, I'm probably doing myself a disservice here in saying that, but I definitely wasn't confident.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'm going to keep going, because I'm a very driven person and I like to see things through to the end. So I was just like, I'm just going to keep going. So went over to Shanghai, and I remember getting in the taxi and going into town, and I was like, here we go. And I started reciting, lines from the textbook and things that I'd prepared. And instantly, I couldn't understand probably 80%, 90% of what was said. And I was like, oh shit, this is going to be really hard, eh? And then, so he dropped me off, and I was staying in an Airbnb. And those first initial days when I was in China, I had really bad culture shock. I was anxious. I just had this very unsettling pit in my stomach, where I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Am I going to be able to survive here, kind of thing? Because I had no real other plans other to then just study Chinese at the university I was going to. And then gradually that subsided, and I got a few friends, and I found an MMA gym, and I got some of those interests and comforts that I had in Australia. And so I had a regular process. But it was also a very, very lonely time, because I wanted so desperately to be able to engage and speak with people, but you are living in kind of your own little bubble, and you're clawing at it, and you're trying to poke it and break it and get out it. With every interaction that you have, you're trying to engage in a meaningful way, and you just never get to that point. Or there are moments of connection, but they're few and far between. And it's just, it very is much true. It was the idea of whenever I would get into the taxi, because we used to take taxis to drive everywhere, I would resign myself to talk to the taxi driver. I'm like, you're talking to the taxi driver. And so I'd get a little further down the conversation, and then into territory where I don't know. And then with the next taxi driver, we'd get a little bit further down the track, a few more exchanges. And so that was an exciting process. But by the time I left China, I was far more confident. But it's been 9 years now, and I'm still very much a student of the game. I'm still studying.
You got to take a leaf out of. So my friend Nick, who's a stunt guy, and he was here for the circus. So he was working in one of the circs, and I actually met him in Canberra by just chance, right? So a Chinese guy had come to Australia to do the circus show. Met him in a hotel hotel gym in Canberra, and at the time, and shout out to Nick, because it was quite funny. Nick was there. He's jacked, right? So he's there. He's taking selfies of himself in the gym. I'm like, look at this guy, right? But Nick, to his credit, came up and actually started talking to me, and we got on really well. And I said, look, when you come to Sydney, let me know. I'll take you around and blah blah blah. And I did a podcast with him, and with Nick's method so Nick speaks Chinese, speaks French, English. What else? I think he speaks 4 languages or something like that, right? And part of the reason for that, he credits obviously the dating game, right?
Oh, okay, of course.
Yeah, so
there's always one of those guys in your class.
Exactly, right? If you want to learn the language, you just got to try and date more chicks.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
You didn't try and pursue that avenue?
No, man, it wasn't for me. I've met Nick characters, so do go on.
So okay, from that perspective, in terms of the adjusting culturally, right? Did you gain an appreciation for Chinese thinking? When I say that, right? People obviously talk about China being a communist society, right? when I've been to China, it's very hard to see the communism like when you're there, right? Because it just feels like any sort of bustling city, right? So when you think about it from an economical standpoint, there's shops, there's people.
You can buy what you want.
You buy whatever you want. Anything that you could dream of is available there.
Yeah.
So you don't really see it pervade life from that perspective, right? I think where you'd notice it, and where I'd notice it as an example, is that you couldn't check certain news sites, right? So if you wanted to read the Australian news, you can't really read the Australian news because it's censored, right? And I think that's where you start to realize that, hey, some of these things aren't available. But like, did you? I guess what was your experience with that?
When I was living there was the similar experience to you. You're in a bustling city. I didn't know as much about China as I do now. But yeah, I mean, like, your movement isn't impaired. Well, actually it is. If you're a foreigner, like, you will have some difficulty getting to like certain provinces and certain areas. Like, there are places that you can and can't go. Well, you need to take your passport with you to use like the rail systems and things like that, and to check into hotels. And when you travel, you need to report to like the police bureau of where you're traveling to that you're here and like you're a foreigner kind of thing. So there are like restrictions in that regard. But in terms of life in the city, man, it's like any other city. And it's even, people have this idea of, well, Chinese people are being oppressed and whatever because it's an authoritarian nation state. But the freedom aspect, apart from what you were mentioning in terms of the news, in terms of everyday lived experience, it's much alike, as you mentioned, like any kind of other bustling and big city. And so, my experience there was, I never really encountered any the only bizarre thing that happened, man, was that I was traveling to Japan briefly to visit a friend. I'd been in China then for 4 months or 5 months or so, and in order to upgrade my visa, to get a visa that allows you to leave and come back, you had to take this medical test. And man, it was the most comprehensive medical test I've ever done in my life. Like, I remember it was in like the outskirts of Shanghai. There was a separate hospital that was set up just for medical examinations of foreigners. And you went in there, dude, it was like, thinking back on it now years later, super weird. Like, you put on a gown. You're asked to do all different kinds of, like, there's heart tests, eye tests. They take your blood, all of these different kinds of things. And they allege it's because they want to make sure that you don't have any kind of debilitating disease or something like that.
They're using it for CRISPR.
Yeah, they're using it for CRISPR. Well,
they've got the Goik genes now.
Mate, I say one of the things that motivates me to keep on competing in martial arts is knowing that there's some copy of me in China, some clone copy currently training now. So that's what motivates me, mate. One day I'll meet him and I'll best him. But man, it is a very tricky. I think one of the things people fail to realize as well is that the relationship between the state and the people in China is different. So, for example, in like the context of a liberal democracy, we're used to the idea of the government and our politicians being our representatives, right? They're not an actor that stands. The government is an actor that stands above society, but it emanates from within it, and it's comprised of us, right? We the people.
That's right.
But in China, both historically, like during the dynastic periods, and today under the Chinese Communist Party, the idea is very much that, if you read the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, they refer to themselves as the Vanguard of the people, which is the idea that a group of scientifically educated elite can lead the masses in the direction of like social prosperity and harmony, right? Which is obviously a very different idea to the idea of the government being kind of the protector of our inherent rights as equal citizens, like within a society. The idea in China is much more that there's a leading class that knows what's in the best interest of society and leads. And this also goes back, like, one of the things that I'm interested in my research on the social credit system in China is how Confucian ideas, but also legalist ideas from the legalist school of thinking in China, which was around the same period when Confucius was writing. But how are these traditional thoughts on governance being revived and reimagined to justify new systems of surveillance and new systems of credit? And one of the interesting things is like in the Confucian tradition, you know, you have these relationships that are emphasized, you know, between father and son, husband and wife, and ruler and subordinate, etc. And in the Confucian philosophy, the idea is very much not on, you know, people think of China as like, oh, a collectivist society, and, you know, a country like Australia being individualist. But in that tradition, it's not necessary. So if we're very focused on individualism and on the sanctity of being, you know, an autonomous person that it has a separate identity from other people, and we should celebrate that fact. In China and in Confucianism, the idea is the emphasis is on the relationship. So it's not even on people. Like people sometimes confuse and think, oh, it's a collectivist kind of orientation. But the emphasis is on their relationship. The idea is if you fulfill your rights and obligations to me, and I fulfill them to you, and we both understand that as the father, I have certain rights and responsibilities, and I can use a combination of reward and punishment to exercise those. Yeah, to exercise those to raise my child. And the child recognizes that there is that discrepancy and that they have to honor that, and also recognize that there are responsibilities that they have to fulfill. If everyone in society fulfills those mutual obligations and responsibilities to one another, that's how you arrive at a harmonious society. Yeah. And that's a really, really key idea. And it's very often overlooked, but it's also the case that those same kind of relationships, like the relationship between the father and son, is used to describe and explicate the relationship, for example, between the state and the people. So where the father is the state or the mother is the state, and this is seen commonly now in propaganda surrounding Xi Jinping's China dream. It's the equation of the family with the nation, right? It's a nationalism that's predicated on the foundational role that the family plays in Chinese society. And there's, you know, these equations in propaganda that you see, 国是家, the family, the nation is the family. And so, there is that discrepancy where you do see, you know, in our context, we view the state and the government as representative of the people, whereas in China, it's much more a paternal-like dynamic. Yeah. I think we need to acknowledge that as well.
Look, I think this is where I find it really interesting in terms of, you know, Australian perspective at the present moment. You know, I feel like a lot of, you don't even know how many people have these thoughts, right? Because, you know, a lot of people don't really want to talk about politics, you know, and it's quite odd because, you know, I've got like, you know, friends that I went to high school with, educated guys that are like, oh, you know, I don't really want to think about this, right? So it's like, you know, they're happy to just worry about their own bubble and their own life. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we've got an election coming up, and there's going to, you know, everybody's got to really have a think about, you know, what is it that you value? Yeah. Right? Because I feel like a lot of the ideology at the present moment, and especially in response to, you know, COVID, the ideology has really gone more and more to the left, right? And when you go to the far left, it's basically heading to that communism, socialism style of governance, right? So, and for me as a you know, I view myself as an autonomous individual. You know, I want to be able to make my own decisions. I want to be able to make my own choices. I look at that and I go, this is really interesting because, you know, when people are asking the government to protect them or to make the rules to protect the people, and I get really conflicted about it, right? Because I feel like, okay, let's think about this, because a common one that would come up would be like, okay, it's like having road rules, right? And so the road rules are there for the good of people, right? So that we have less accidents, right? The roads are easier to navigate and drive. And yeah, like, you know, I think from facilitating, you know, the infrastructure of roadways and the laws that surround roads, it's very logical to have road laws, right? Like, so how you drive and licensing and that sort of thing, you know. But then when it comes to telling people you know, people even saying to the government that we shouldn't have removed mandates so early, and, you know, made the changes that we did, you know, it's like, I'm torn, you know, because I feel like, you know, there is an element where, you know, like as Perrottet said, like, you know, people need to make their own decisions in terms of what they want to, what sort of risk you're willing to accommodate, right? So, and I feel like I stand definitely more on that side of the discussion than on the government's there to protect me, because I feel like, you know, in any big corporation, so you think about any big corporation in the world, the idea behind all what the essence of that corporation is there to do is produce profit, right? For whether it's for its shareholders or for whatever. You could have a different culture internally where the people want to make, are happy to produce these things because they're really proud of the product that they produce. But at the end of the day, they need to drive profit, right? So, I think about, I try and think about government in the same light. If government was a corporation, what is the essence of government, right? Because at the end of the day, the only real time that there is competition in terms of government is when there's an election.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, you've got autocratic rule for 4 years in terms of what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious in terms of your thoughts because you've experienced it from the China side of it, and your thesis is going to be on the social credit score, right?
Yeah, social credit system. That's right.
And so social credit system. I'm really curious in terms of what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I am similarly tormented, and I think one of the things that makes it so hard is, like we were talking about before, is that this isn't a black or white dichotomy. Things exist on a spectrum, and I feel like, obviously, the example we just gave where it's like government says government has our best interests in mind, so we follow the government or we oblige what they're telling us. Obviously, there's issues, and this is some of the inherent issues that China's political system faces with corruption, with issues of getting information out when it's needed, like when people need to make informed decisions as individuals, like getting them the right information or... Yeah, there's having mechanisms that can look at the job that governments are doing and to check, are they living up to what they're preaching, which is very important. At the same time, I feel like it's interesting seeing how different, not just China, but different states in Asia responded to COVID in terms of mask mandates and in terms of different measures that on the whole were taken up by the population more willingly than in contexts like liberal democracy, like in Australia or like the US or somewhere else in Europe. Yep. And I think that there's a few things that has contributed towards, in the context of Australia and the US and some other places that have continued to struggle with COVID, is that it's the first real crisis. Like pandemics, if you think about disasters, a pandemic is the worst one, man, because it's like if you have a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami, you have the event and then it's over and then you rebuild. Like this is something where this is ongoing for 2 years. It requires coordination. It requires synchrony across like a population of 10 million, 100 million, a billion people in the case of China. And so it's a very difficult challenge for governments to meet, and people recognize that now. They recognize, given the situation with Omicron in Australia and around the world, is that they're not in control. They're not in control of the situation. They're trying their best, but they're failing and they're making bad decisions along the way. And when the dust settles, we'll be able to look clearly at what those decisions were and be able to say there was a bad decision. But at the current moment, I think another issue is that since World War II, people in advanced liberal democracies have not been able, that we haven't faced a crisis that required any amount of coordination to face, right? Like during World War II, we were put on a war front, women went into manufacturing. There were all of these changes that took place in response to that. And there was an idea of sacrifice. The idea of extraordinary circumstance means sacrificing willingly, okay? The other element I think that's adding to this is the influence of consumer culture, because consumer culture, particularly as it ramped up in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, tells people you should be able to buy what you want when you want. You should be able to go wherever the fuck you want to go, whenever you want to, with no consequence. And in fact, you can be a really, public, in terms of your public ethic, you don't have to engage with your community and other members as equals at all. You could actually treat them like shit and you'll still be at the top of the socioeconomic bracket, right? And be able to make what decisions you want. So I think that in combination, these things can lead people to have an attitude of like, even giving the constraints that we're in, and when we know about transmissibility of viruses and things like this, is an unwillingness to oblige to any of these demands or to sacrifice anything. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, to because at the end of the day, the government has the capacity to take away your rights and your liberties and your liberties. You also have the capacity to sacrifice your individual interests in terms of like going somewhere or buying something for the collective, like your fellow neighbor, and you can do that willingly. And like obviously that is a decision that has to be made on the facts, but it's very difficult to ascertain the facts when it's happening on a rapidly changing,
and the news cycle is so short now.
Exactly.
It's like we're always just looking for what is that next silver bullet. That's one of the things that I find remiss, is that I think, you know, we're so conditioned to looking for that silver bullet. Is we're taking the first order consequence, but not really thinking about the second and third order consequence. You know, there's obviously, you know, massive impacts from an economic standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, like, you know, but we don't really engage and discuss these things as openly as we should. You know, it's just like having that hard conversation with a mate who might be thinking about it, right? We sort of ignore the elephant in the room because it's easier to just talk about, you know, something else.
Right. Solutions to the pressing to the issue at hand, right?
Yeah. So you know, like I liken it to, we slap Band-Aids on, but we never fix the root cause of the trauma. Yeah. Right. And you can put a Band-Aid on a deep cut, but if you never stitch it up, it's never going to heal properly. Right. You need to actually, sometimes it might mean that, hey, before we go and stitch it up, we need to actually make sure that there's nothing left in this wound. Right. Yep. And that's where I feel like, you know, and that's why I'm torn, because obviously, you know, being a guy from a Chinese background, I can see it from that perspective that, you know, hey, yeah, like it could be good that, you know, the government tells us what we should and shouldn't do. Yeah. But I can also see it from the other perspective of, I wouldn't have been afforded the opportunities that I had in life if I wasn't given the opportunity to be who I wanted to be and make the decisions that I want to be, right? So it's almost like it pulls you in both directions. Yeah. Right. And I don't think there's an easy answer to it, right? No. But I guess, you know, I am curious in terms of, you know, from your research in terms of the social credit system, like, so, and the reason why I'm interested in this is because, so there's a guy on, I don't know if you've watched any of his videos, but there's a guy named Su Xiaodong. He's an MMA coach in Beijing, I think, or one of the major cities in China. But basically he got famous on YouTube because
he challenged all the
guy.
I've seen it. And
so, you know, as a result of that, you know, there was a narrative, and I don't know how true it is or not, but apparently, you know, his social credit rating is through the floor because the government didn't like that he was challenging, you know, all of these traditional martial arts because, you know, there's heritage attached to that, there's culture attached to that. And it's impacted the face in terms of, you know, he's almost like saying, you know, the Western way of martial arts is better than the Eastern way of martial arts. Right. And I think that's a misinterpretation because I think, you know, if you want to, I think generally speaking, most martial arts have come from a very similar place. Right. When I say that, you can find evidence of wrestling going back, you know, millennia. Yep. Right. Whether it's the Greek style of wrestling, but there was wrestling in India as well. Right. You know, a lot of martial arts in terms of Chinese martial arts has actually come from India, from the Buddhist monk, you know, Damo or Bodhidharma. And that, you know, has sort of, you know, went from India through China and then obviously into Japan, and Okinawan karate and all those sort of styles have come from all of that as well. So like, martial arts in essence has been around for a very, very long time. So, you know, it's a punch is still a punch, a kick is still a kick. Right. Right. I always like to think that the only difference is that between styles nowadays is the rules that you operate on, because if you create rules, then obviously that's going to change the way that people actually play to take advantage of those rules. And then, you know, on the flip side, you know, like I think a lot of the techniques that we do nowadays can be found in, you know, in pictures in the past. Yeah. Right?
And that's the thing. Things, in martial arts tend to come in
cyclical.
It's cyclic. Yeah, you see things like I saw this amazing crescent kick by this guy the other day in the UFC. I actually forget the fighter's name, but an amazing crescent kick knocked the guy out cold. And it's things that seem like they're outdated tend to have a tendency to come back in fashion down the track. So, but it is interesting that across different, kind of like the evolution of philosophy, like at the same time that Confucius was writing, you know, we had Socrates and Plato and these Greek thinkers coming around, and we had, you know, the Buddha as well. So, and martial arts had a similar kind of history where at the same time in different cultures people were experimenting with you're grappling and with striking and these things, and it shows like it's an inherent part of humans.
So from in terms of social credit system, so do you, how does it operate in China?
Oh, Johnny, that's $1 million question, mate. You should read my thesis, and so should your audience when it is available.
Can you give us a synopsis?
Yeah, so it's tricky, man, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the social credit system is and what it does. I mean, the first thing to iterate is that there is no overarching social credit system, and individual citizens don't have a numerical score that determines their life opportunities or restrictions. So in 2014, there was this guiding outline that was published by the Chinese State Council, which is like the highest kind of executive branch of the government. And essentially, it instructed commercial actors, so these big tech companies, but also local governments and government ministries at the national level and courts to go out and start experimenting with social credit. And essentially, you can break down the social credit system into different systems within itself. So that planning outline was kind of like a blueprint. And then out of that blueprint emerged, there were things that were happening in the past, obviously, but for the sake of the conversation, I'll keep it simple. Out of that blueprint emerged a bunch of different systems that have different functions. So at the most well-known, or one of the most well-known systems is the national level credit system or social credit system. And this is comprised of a series of blacklists and red lists. Okay, so a series of agreements between different government ministries, courts, and also these memorandums of understanding assigned with commercial internet companies as well, where essentially, take an example, if I am someone who defaults on a court-ordered judgment, if I've been laundering money or caught for fraud or anything like this, and I don't turn up to court and I refuse to pay my debts, I'll be added to this blacklist, right? The Supreme People's Court will add me to this blacklist. And then how the system works is it's based on a joint reward and sanction mechanism. So that blacklist will be shared. The Supreme Court will send that judgment to a national level database that all of these different ministries have access to. And then it'll be shared with all of those other ministries. And they each have their own blacklists, like a blacklist for no flying, a blacklist for being banned, for example, riding the high-speed train, for buying certain luxury goods and items. Because the idea is that if you owe money, you should pay your dues before you enjoy the other privileges that everyone else enjoys, right? So what happens is that when the system is fully functioning, and with this court defaulters blacklist that I just described, it is functioning quite well. What happens is the blacklist is shared with all these other ministries, and you face a cascade of punishments. So all of a sudden, you're banned from riding the train, from flying, and yada, yada, yada. So that's like a national level system. It's not based on scoring or rating. It's based on if you are if you are not living up to certain established rules, regulations, and laws, that this is kind of an enforcement mechanism.
Okay.
Then
I can see a lot of people wanting that.
Yeah. Well, that's why in China, my research is actually specifically focused on the sociological element to all of this in terms of if I'm black, because the other dimension to this is how people that are blacklisted are framed by the media, described as lao lai, which is this derogatory term for someone who may be super rich, they have the money, but they're just not willing to pay it back. They're an inherently selfish person. And in Chinese propaganda, there are some cracker Chinese propaganda like cartoons. They have imagination, I'll tell you that much. But they're often portrayed as really fat individuals, so selfish individuals, and they're called lao lai. And when you talk to people and say, do you know anyone that's on a blacklist? They'll refer to people on the blacklist as lao lai. So there's this whole moralizing dimension to all of this. And the question that I have in motivating my research is, what is actually the social consequences of you being blacklisted? Does it impact your family relations? Does it impact your friends? Like, are people less willing to engage with you generally, or only in financial matters? And so there's all of these unanswered questions that researchers are trying to solve now. And I've got a peer-reviewed article coming out soon if anyone's keen. But that's only one element. So that's the national level system. You also have, on a local government level, all of these cities that have now been told to create their own social credit systems that are based on quantified scoring and rating. Okay, so if you volunteer, if you participate in some charitable behavior, if you or maybe if you're found to litter, for example, that would have a negative impact. But all these cities have slightly different ways of measuring what they consider to be trustworthy versus untrustworthy behavior and the like. And what's really interesting is that you would think, wow, that would surely be the most consequential system and everyone would be super concerned about that. But I have a friend of mine that's working in one of the key demonstration cities that has developed the social credit system in its own context most thoroughly. And he says that even though there are like public LED screens and displays of people with credit scores and, you know, this person did this and yada, yada, people do not care at all. Like he struggles to get people to share, you know, to say anything. It just doesn't seem to have that much of a impact on their everyday lived experience. And I think a lot of cities also view it sometimes as, or a lot of local governments view it as, this is the central government in Beijing, like with its new campaign, and there'll be another campaign in like 2 months anyway, and we'll be on to working on that one anyway. So people kind of dismiss it on that local level.
Okay.
But it's hard because obviously you don't know what it's actually like in all of these different cities that are experimenting with it and that are incorporating it. So that's like the local level system. So you've got this national level government system based on blacklists and red lists. Red lists are the opposite, where if you adhere to government regulations, you're rewarded with like government procurement opportunities, reduced tax rates, these kinds of things. So at the same time as your competitor, if it's a company, is getting slammed for failing to live up to like environmental regulations, your opponent or your competitor is getting rewarded and streamlined. And so you can see how that's why a lot of people in China that are advocates for the system thinks that it can really be this kind of enforcement mechanism that encourages market behaviors that are in line with what state imperatives. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so the final dimension then is what most individual citizens are familiar with, and these are commercial level social credit systems. So these are systems that are run through like some of these tech platforms like Ant Finance, or it's just called Ant now. But, you know, apps like Alipay that everyone in China is using to do all kinds of different things. Yeah. And it's mainly a loyalty reward type program. So if you consume a lot through the platform, if you're on the platform a lot, if you have a large social network, these kinds of things can contribute towards you having a good score. But then it also bleeds into, you know, functions that you would normally associate with the state, such as the granting of visas. Like if you have a high credit score, commercial credit score, you can very quickly get a visa, right, to another country. They take that as a proxy for you being like an honest and trustworthy person. So it's really interesting topic, man. I've definitely learnt a lot. I think we're only scratching the surface in terms of the impacts of this and uncovering people's actual lived experience under this system. But yeah,
and I think there's going to be a whole gambit of experience. Like, you know, if you're going to talk to somebody on the blacklist, they're going to have a very negative experience, and then somebody on the red list would be like, this is the best thing ever. Right, because you're getting preferential treatment.
Well, it's interesting because I talked with 9 people who had met someone that had been blacklisted. And what was interesting is, you know, I would say, because people have a tendency to be like, if you're on a blacklist, you're a lie, right? Yeah. If someone's a stranger and they're on the blacklist, then they're a lie. But if it's a friend or a family, they'll use contextual issues or they'll appeal to the person's character to argue that no, they made a mistake, but it's not an indication of who they are as a person, right? They can be redeemed. At the same time, though, they do think it's right that they've been punished to the extent that they've been punished. So the formal punishments, things like them being banned from flying and things like that, they're actually in favour for because they think that the rule was broken and amends have to be made. And if, you know, my relative is allowed to keep on borrowing money and they do borrow money, that could cause greater financial harm. Yep. So it's interesting. The other element to this is that, you know, some people associate the credit system because there's this moralising dimension behind all of this. And it's about improving the moral quality of the citizens, right? It's, again, this goes to the idea of the party as the vanguard of the people. It doesn't just want people to live according to the law, but it wants to improve the moral quality of the people so that people can restrain themselves from within, because their actions are going to align naturally with what benefits, you know, the nation as a collective if they're instructed right and trained right. And yeah, the interesting thing is that some people interpret the social credit system as being aimed at 不文明人, so people that are uncivilized, right? This idea of not so much now, but in recent past decades, you would hear about in China complain bitterly about, 随地吐痰, people spitting on the road or littering, or being out in public and cursing people and speaking loudly on the phone in cinemas, or one big one was people stealing seats on the high-speed train. And there was all these famous videos of that went viral of people refusing to give a seat that they hadn't booked up to the person who had booked it. And people are saying, well, that person is uncivilized and they need to be banned. And so some people see the social credit system targeting these kinds of behaviors, not just purely the financial.
Yep.
So it's interesting, like there's a mixture of ideas about what this kind of a system should do, what kind of behaviors it should target, and why.
I find it interesting because it's almost like, two different styles of parenting, right? So you think about it from that perspective, taking on board the relationship analogy. You have this very overbearing parent who, has a very complex system of reward and punishment to try and get the best out of their children. And then the alternative, from I guess, thinking about it from the Western perspective, is that you have this parent who has, a loose set of rules in place in terms of, what is the infrastructure and what are the things that you should and shouldn't do. And then the rest of it is sort of taught to you almost like by your peer network. Yeah. Right? You grow up in this culture and you realize, okay, it's not right to do these things because that's not culturally acceptable. Right? And I can see positives and negatives in both. And why I grapple with it is because I look at it from the perspective of how do I teach my own kids, And like I think, and this is I love this analogy because I use this one a lot, but I think about, to get good at anything. So if we go back to martial arts and sort of bring this conversation full circle.
Oh, wow.
Sorry,
that truly is full circle.
Anyway.
You're on fire.
Yeah. So just click.
That's hilarious.
Right? But to get good at anything, you need to have structure, right? So without knowing what are some of the rules and what are the heuristics, what are we trying to achieve, to get to this next level, or what is the outcome that we've got in mind? And you develop your skill set to approach those concepts broadly, right? And generally that could be done through drilling technique as an example, right? But then you get to a point where now you're live rolling or you're free rolling or you're free sparring or whatever you're doing, and you realize that, hey, the amount of situations that I can actually use that particular technique is very limited, right? So what happens is that if you are so ingrained in this structure, you get to this point where you've outgrown the cage, but you can't do anything about it, right? So at some point, you either need a bigger cage or you need to have no cage, right? Once you know enough of the structure in terms of what is the general direction in terms of what you want to achieve, and then you have to apply some of your own understanding and knowledge in terms of, what are the concepts here and what is going to be my guiding principles, right, to actually achieve the outcome that you want. Right. So, and I guess, how I view when you think about it from the Eastern perspective in terms of like what China's trying to do with their system, is that the problem is that you get to this point where if you are not upgrading your cage as quickly as possible to make sure that it's meeting the requirements, the growth requirements of its people, when people get locked in a cage, their only option is to fight back. Yeah,
tear it down.
Right? So that is the negative blind side in terms of, if you're not continually working on this cage. Right. The problem in terms of the other method of thinking is that if your cage is too large and there's no structure, you don't really facilitate any growth. Right? So it's hard to say which is the right one.
It is. And it's, the age-old problem is who determines what is undesirable behavior versus not undesirable behavior, and does it vary in different contexts? Like there has been situations, for example, in Suzhou, I think a couple of years ago now, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, the local government there, on their WeChat page, they broadcast the names and faces of individuals in public wearing sleepwear, right? And they said, wearing sleepwear in public is uncivilized, and they gave all these reasons. And then they faced a, litany of public complaints from, citizens being like, that's ridiculous. Like, how can you criticize people for this? Like, this is absurd. And they were forced to take it down, and they issued an apology, right? Wow. So there is there's more give and take in the relationship between the state and the people in China. And there's also this interesting dynamic that people that are, casual observers can fail to realize, is that there's also a tenuous relationship between central authorities and local governments, right? Because what one of my colleagues found in a recent survey study was that members of the general public were more in favor than the social credit system than government employees. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, the social credit system, one function of it is to ensure that, local governments are living up to their response. Yeah, because a big problem, the mountains are high and the emperor's far away. It's this saying that, it's said a lot, but it still does really apply to China now. How does the central government in authoritarian state ensure that people in far-flung regions are doing
the right thing?
Yeah, doing the right thing and following through on their promises and things like this. And so, there is an element of the social credit system that targets, governments and government employees and makes sure that they're obliging by their responsibilities and stuff. And that has resulted, it seems, in a somewhat less favourable stance towards the system in general than the general public. So there's all these interesting dynamics that illustrate how nuanced the situation actually is. And, the relationship between the citizens and the state in China is far more complicated than people give it credit for. And particularly this idea of, the state is oppressing the people at all times and in all places. It's not true. And there's all these kinds of interesting dynamics, both in the revolutionary period, but also now, where citizens are mobilized and demobilized in certain ways to achieve government imperatives. But the government's also influenced by citizens. Another big thing that people fail to recognize is that online consultation and deliberation with interest groups in China and members of the public in China is now an institutionalized practice. So there are now, there's an e-parliament website where, people in China can, vote for certain policies. But one of the main areas that it's been illustrated has to be having an effect is in the area of policy reform. So, for example, there was a researcher, Joel Kornreich, in 2019. He looked at a reform for healthcare, where there was a reform for healthcare that was put online for people to comment in on. And what he observed was that, they got however many thousand comments from citizens and recommendations. And what he observed was that the majority of those were actually incorporated into the policy that was then enacted. So there is greater, obviously this needs to be contextualized against the free, the censorship and other issues within social media in terms of, what you can and can't say about the party itself. But when it comes to the government bureaucracy, it's different. You need to separate in your mind the party and the government, because they're yes, the party's controlling both, but it's more willing to listen to criticisms levied at the government or at local government, because you actually need some kind of venting.
Feedback for policy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting relationship.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that's a great way to end this.
That is a fantastic way. Man, when you said we've come full circle before, man, that was that was on point, eh?
All right. So, yeah, you're going to have this, your paper will be published soon?
Yeah, the one that I mentioned about us interviewing people that had been blacklisted should be out hopefully sometime in the coming months.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm going to have more stuff out soon, man.
Okay. And if people want to find you, how should they find you?
Oh, man, you can find my Jiu Jitsu stuff at Instagram at Alex _Goik.
Goik.
Goik. Yep. And apart from that, yeah, we'll just leave it for that. You'll hear about me in the future, maybe.
All right. Done. All right. Thanks,
awesome.
everyone.
Thanks, bro.